Hello again. We are going to continue our series in the different feasts that we see in the Old Testament. And this morning, we're going to be looking at the Feast of Tabernacles. This was the last feast of the Jewish calendar, and some would say the most important feast even. So we're going to be looking at that. It's John chapter 1, verse 14, chapter 7. It's kind of all over the place. But we're going to be looking in Leviticus first, Leviticus chapter 23, if you want to go ahead and turn there. The Feast of Tabernacles, also known as the Feast of Booths, was a week-long feast beginning on a Sabbath, and then would continue for another 6 days, and it would technically end on an 8th day with the final Sabbath. So it was a week-long celebration, first commanded in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 33 to 44. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel, saying, on the 15th day of the 7th month, and for 7 days..." And there were bells. There weren't bells, there were trumpets. "On the 15th day of the 7th month, and for 7 days is the Feast of Booths to the Lord. On the first day shall be a holy convocation. You shall not do any ordinary work. For 7 days you shall present food offerings to the Lord. On the 8th day you shall hold a convocation and present a food offering to the Lord. It is a solemn assembly. You shall not do any ordinary work. These are the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you shall proclaim as times of holy convocation, for presenting to the Lord food offerings, burnt offerings, and grain offerings, sacrifices and drink offerings, each on its proper day, besides the Lord's Sabbaths, and besides your gifts, and besides all your vow offerings, and besides all your free will offerings, which you give to the Lord. On the 15th day of the 7th month, when you have gathered in the produce of the land, you shall celebrate the feast of the Lord 7 days. On the first day shall be a solemn rest, and on the 8th day shall be a solemn rest. And you shall take on the first day the fruit of the splendid trees, branches of palm trees, and boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook. And you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. You shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days in the year. It is a statute forever throughout your generations. You shall celebrate it in the 7th month. You shall dwell in booths for 7 days. All native Israelites shall dwell in booths, that your generations may know that I made the people of Israel dwell in booths when I brought them up out of the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Thus Moses declared to the people of Israel the appointed feasts of the Lord. It's called the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, because that's one of the primary things that they did for that whole week. They would build these hastily constructed huts, kind of like tents. And they were reminders that the Israelites, as they traveled through the wilderness after God brought them up out of Egypt, that this is the Israelites remembering that. So they didn't have a home. They didn't have a place to lay their head. They were wanderers. They were strangers in a land. And so they had these hastily constructed huts, these booths. The Hebrew word is sukkot. And they would eat there and they would sleep there. They wouldn't stay there all day, but that's where they would sleep and that's where they would eat. So it was big enough to have actually there's a special table. It was a 3-sided table that they would recline at and eat inside of these booths. There was no solid ceiling to it. They would use leafy coverings so that during the day they had shade, and during the evening they could look through them and see the stars at night. It was common to decorate them with different leafy plants or vines, fruits. Today, modern Jews, when they still celebrate this, it's even been approved that they can use Christmas lights. They decorate them and they make them look nice, but they're temporary. You may also remember that God, when He was with the Israelites in the wilderness, had a temporary dwelling called the tabernacle. And it was no solid walls, no solid roof. It was wood beams covered with gold, and they would cover over that with these massive curtains. And then when it was time to move, they'd pack it all up and set it up in the next place. It was all temporary. It was never permanent. The Israelites, as they were traveling through the wilderness, they were seeking God's rest. They were seeking the promised land. They'd been brought out of Egypt and they were looking for something better, but that generation that was saved from Egypt never got to enter God's rest. Not during this lifetime. They died in the wilderness. This celebration, this Feast of Tabernacles, is a reminder of seeking God's rest. It's also called the Feast of Ingathering. That's one of the other names for this feast. Because during this feast time, the Israelites, they would make sacrifices every day. Sacrifices of animals and of grain, free will offerings, and much more. They were celebrating the end of the current harvest season. So there was a whole lot of celebration. There was a whole lot of food for a week of feasts. Part of the celebration involved a water ceremony, a water drawing. With the end of the harvest season, it was time for the rainy season to come. And so part of each day's celebration included a ceremony where they would pray for God to send rain in the coming season. Each morning, a priest would go to the pool of Siloam, the only water source for Jerusalem. And they would take a golden pitcher, and they would get water from the pool, and then they would carry it back to the temple and pour it in a basin at the foot of the altar. This water that they poured into this basin was symbolic of two things. First, it was symbolic of the prayers that the people were offering for rain. We do a lot of visual representations of prayers, and I think that's a great thing. One of the common things we do today is with the sand. People pouring sand into a jar to show their prayers for a certain thing. Writing down prayers in a journal. Anything that we do to have a visual representation of our prayers. Kind of like the priest would burn incense as an offering, as a prayer. Well, this is what the water was. It was a visual representation of the prayers that they were offering for the rainy season. But the other thing that it represented, and the thing I think which is more important, is it was a reminder that God was going to pour out His Spirit on His people. God was going to pour out His Spirit on His people. And the Israelites knew this, and they were expecting it. They were waiting for it. But they didn't get to see that happen. Every single morning, the priest would go through this ceremony. And they waited and waited and waited for the Holy Spirit to come. When people asked why this particular ceremony was called the drawing out of water, they were told because of the pouring out of the Holy Spirit. The same Holy Spirit that we received at Pentecost. God poured out His Spirit on all people, on those who would follow Him. This occasion was so joyous that, according to the Talmud, the Hebrew writings, the Jewish writings, that some of the leaders, some of the rabbis said that he who has not seen rejoicing at the place of water drawing has never seen rejoicing in his life. That is how much celebration, that is how joyous it was as the people celebrated while this water was being gathered and poured out, as they awaited the Holy Spirit of God. It was a great time of celebration. Some of the priests would sing and chant, "Save now, Hosanna," or, as we often translate, Hosanna. "Save now, I beseech thee, O Lord. O Lord, I beseech thee, send now prosperity." The priests would sing this, and they would march around the altar singing this. And on the seventh day of the feast, the celebration was the greatest of all. It was called Hoshana Rabbah, Great Praise Day. You can imagine, if you have a day that you celebrate every year and it's called Great Praise Day, it's going to be pretty joyous. And that's what it was. And it was on this day that we read something Jesus did pretty profound. John chapter 7, verses 37 to 39. On the last and greatest day of the festival, Jesus stood and said in a loud voice, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." By this he meant the Spirit, whom those who believed in him would later receive. Up to that time the Spirit had not been given, since Jesus had not yet been glorified. After the pouring of water in the basin by the priest, there is often a moment of extreme silence. The Israelites would calm and quiet, and they would contemplate God's Spirit. They had just gone from being extremely loud and joyous and celebrating, and all of a sudden there's quiet. And some commentators think that it's during this time of quiet, during this time where all of a sudden you could hear a pin drop, that Jesus said, "Let anyone who's thirsty come to me and drink the living water." How rude. Unless, of course, you're God in the flesh. For anyone else to do this, that would be certainly something that would make the religious leaders angry. But here, God was in their midst offering living water. It's not for sure, but it's possible. Perhaps it was during that silent time that Jesus said it, but it is for sure that it was on that last day. Jesus, God in the flesh, God tabernacled with us. This is another way of showing that Jesus fulfilled this ceremony, this Feast of Tabernacles. Recall that God resided in a temporary dwelling with the Israelites. But let's also look at John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. It's really interesting, and I didn't realize this until I studied for this sermon, but the words used there in John chapter 1, verse 14, where it says, he came and dwelt among us, it's actually the same words that they would have used to say, he came and tabernacled with us. That's kind of a weird way to say it, so we don't use tabernacle. It's not really meant to be a verb. But that's what the language says. He came and tabernacled with us. Jesus is God tabernacling with us. It's kind of weird. But that's another way that Jesus fulfilled this. God among his people again. Emmanuel, God with us. And just as the Israelites were seeking rest in the wilderness, Jesus offered that too. Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. Jesus offers a rest that the world can't give. He offers a rest that the Israelites sought, but never found. He offers a rest because we can know and rest in the truth that God offers salvation that we could never earn by our own merit. Jesus offers a rest and a peace that a crazy world just cannot comprehend. So Jesus fulfilled the Feast of Tabernacles in that way as well. There's one other major part of the festival, this feast, that I want to point out. And that is the illumination of the temple. This was a big ceremony as well, one that would take place every day. There were 4 giant lampstands, kind of like menorahs, 75 feet tall. Big lampstands. And the youth, the Israelite youth, they would have to climb ladders and pour oil into the different parts of the candle there. There were 4 branches on each one that would burn. And they would use the worn out garments of the priests as the wicks for these massive lights. They were so bright that the Israelites said that the lights from these menorahs, from these lampstands, would light up every courtyard in Jerusalem. They were placed right there in the temple courts of the temple, but they were so bright, it was lighting up all of Jerusalem. But it wasn't just a light show. It was also representative of 2 very important things. One of them was the Shekinah glory, or the light of lights. It was to remind the Israelites of God's glory when he came upon the temple that Solomon built. And so these lights there at the temple, they were to remind the Israelites of God's glory, of his light. The second thing that it was to remind them of was that God was to be a light to the nations, a light to those who were lost in the darkness. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 2. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. I think you can probably see where this is going. The other way that Jesus fulfilled this Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus is that light. Either still on that last and greatest day of the feast, or perhaps the Sabbath day afterwards, when those towering lights were extinguished, Jesus said this in John chapter 8, verse 12. When Jesus spoke again to the people, he said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." I admit, when I've read this before, I just thought, okay, Jesus told people he's the light of the world. It never dawned on me that there was a huge light celebration where the Israelites were looking at these massive lights and they're saying, that is the glory of God, these massive lights. And then either that last day of the celebration when they've had the lights lit, or maybe the Sabbath day after when they've finally been extinguished, Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." The rabbis and the Jewish leaders knew exactly what Jesus was saying. That's why they were so mad at him. Jesus wasn't just saying, "I am a light." He is the light. Jesus is the glory of God. It takes on a whole new meaning. I am the light of the world, and whoever follows me will never walk in darkness. Personally, I think I see this being fulfilled as well at the Transfiguration. That's just a personal thought. The Feast of Tabernacles has been fulfilled. We can find rest in Jesus. Jesus has tabernacled with us. The Holy Spirit has been poured out on God's people, and the light has come and now dwells within us. So even though it's been fulfilled by Jesus in so many ways, I do think there's still an ultimate fulfillment that we can look forward to. We find that in Revelation chapter 21, verses 1 to 7. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people. And God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." And he who was seated on the throne said, "Behold, I am making all things new." Also he said, "Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true." And he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I give from the spring of water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my son." You continue on to verse 23, and it says, "And the city had no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb." God's preparing for us a permanent dwelling. No more huts, no more tabernacles, no more booths, but a place where we will reside with God forever, his dwelling with man. We will have access to living water, just like the pouring of water at the Feast of Tabernacles. God himself will be our light. No more need of celebrations lighting massive candelabras or menorahs, because God himself will be our light. And I think one of the things I'm looking for most of all, we will enter into God's rest. I don't know about you, but I'm looking forward to some rest. Not just rest from day-to-day work. No, we do that. We're used to that. But the kind of rest where we know we are within God's embrace, and there is nothing that is ever going to change that. Where our weary souls can finally rest in God's arms. We will enter into God's rest for all eternity. I want to close with this thought from Paul. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1. "For we know that if the earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal house in heaven, not built by human hands." Paul often used the word tent to describe the bodies we live in now, because what we have now is temporary. What we have now wasn't built to last forever. And so Paul reminds us that the bodies we live in now, they'll be destroyed. But we have a permanent home awaiting for us. One not built by human hands. A heavenly dwelling. These tents, we won't be here forever. Make sure you're not missing your opportunity to enter into the promised land because you were busy, distracted by the wilderness. Let's enter into God's rest. Would you stand with me as we sing our song of invitation?